Here's a toast to the host of men we boast, the U.S. Air Force.
During the Civil War, the Air Force was born. And as early as 1898, the War Department showed interest in the glider. But it took a pair of clever bicycle makers who tinkered with a man-carrying kite to add imagination and power. Wilbur and Orville Wright gave the glider a water-cooled engine of their own design and two chain-driven 8.5-foot pusher propellers. The toss of a coin in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, won Orville Wright the chance to be the first man in history to fly under power.
Air time, 12 seconds. Distance, less than the length of a B-36 wing.
Wilbur Wright went to Europe in 1908 to find a market for the flying machine, which up to then they were unable to sell. His flights on the continent attracted the President of France, as well as the Kings of England, Spain, and Italy. To Wilbur, it was endless work. In addition to acting as pilot, he was ground crew, mechanic, and salesman. A team of horses pulled the plane to a woodmill. This was to serve as a runway on the grassy field. Lifted by a few men, the flying machine was swung into position facing the wind. To provide thrust for the takeoff, the Wrights had developed a weight-falling catapult. After the props were spun, the engine kicked over. Wilbur and his passenger, a French journalist, took seats on the lower wing and braced themselves for an exciting ride. He convinced Europe, winning applause, but no sales.
Back in America, encouraged by President Teddy Roosevelt, the War Department opened bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Signal Corps specifications required that it carry two persons a distance of 125 miles at an average speed of 40 miles an hour. The Wrights signed a stiff contract. Finally, at Fort Myer, Virginia, they flew a machine that was accepted as U.S. Army Airplane Number 1.
By 1913, 41 Army pilots were decorated with these gold military aviator wings. Among them was Lieutenant Henry Arnold, who later, as commanding general of the AAF, led 2.5 million airmen to victory. Another aviation pioneer, Glenn Curtis, also built early Army trainers. Soon, more inventors improved the machine with tractor instead of pusher propellers, and the Army began to see the new airplane emerge as a weapon.
By 1916, our only trained aviators were a few Americans flying with France, and they made us proud. They were the famous Lafayette Escadrille, started by Norman Prince, William Thaw, Victor Chapman, and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the sky over Europe. When German U-boats forced us to declare war, American air power ranked 14th.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. You know, in a couple of weeks, we began to look as though we might do it. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon, we trained with the real things, Lewis machine guns. Having met the requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. Assignments were made. We got a chance to fly. First, we made a pre-flight check of the baling wire planes. Then we tried our wings. "50 hours in the air, a few bombs. We were checked out, ready for advanced training overseas. America was producing airmen, but we didn't have a single fighting airplane. Only a few of our leaders were wise. Newton Baker, Secretary of War, was one. He insisted supremacy of the air in modern warfare is essential. Woodrow Wilson was another. The president asked for $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation. Meanwhile, Red Cross girls saw us off on our way overseas. Since Congress couldn't vote us time, we went to France without airplanes. But we did go in style. Camouflaged luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships. Some of us half-trained flyers went to Britain and Italy, but most of us went to France. There we found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, we practiced gunnery. Wooden models helped us learn how to lead a plane with our fire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show us how to handle the stick. Finally, we soloed. The first ride was always a thrill and a bumpy experience. However, it was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight, even if some of us were lucky.
Late in 1917, France met the AEF's first Aero Squadron, commanded by Major Ralph Royce. His outfit was the first to see action, and they proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes.
Our commander was Colonel Billy Mitchell. America's first flyers were there. General Benjamin Falloy in command of supply and schools. Colonel Thomas Milling, head of Air Service Units, 1st Army. And Colonel Frank Lahm for the 2nd Army, commanded by General Bullard.
When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs. Thor, 5 German planes down. Lieutenant Larner, 3. Lieutenant Merrick, 1. Lieutenant Tobin, 3.
Don't forget the aces. Captain Field Kindley with 12 victories, and Major Raoul Lufberry with 17, before they were both grounded forever. Then those who lived to take part in another war, Captain Elliot Springs with a score of 12, and the ace of aces, hat of the ring, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker with 26 victories.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took us house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses with high pompadours. Meet Rosie the Riveter, 1917. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. The fuselage, which we finally chose, was of British design. The engine was all American. Manufacture was the outstanding production achievement of the war. In all, 4,500 DH-4 airplanes powered by the Liberty engine were put together in this country. They were built by Ford, Lincoln, Cadillac, and Packard, automobile manufacturers. Curtiss, Martin, and Wright, still famous plane-making names, were busy assembly plants in those days. World War I gave America its great aircraft industry. Each plane was test flown. Then, the thousands of parts were painstakingly dismantled for packing under guard. Crated and addressed, it was off to the front.
In France, husky mademoiselles handled the wings like toys. Here, parts were reassembled into the fighting craft, which helped sweep the enemy out of the sky. May 1918, and the first American DH-4s rolled directly from assembly sheds to the airfields. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators ready for the big push.
When the order to prepare for battle was given, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes. There, armorers fused the bombs and loaded the racks. Then the boys who had to take them up made sure the job was done right.
The boys still talk about the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. Billy Mitchell had asked for every Allied airplane that could fight. We brought them out. The brass ordered a tremendous air force to control the skies over the Samahil sector. This was the First Army's field of battle. For the dawn takeoffs, we put flares on our wingtips. Every Allied field on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500. We actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props spit into the air, and the engines began to rev up. Our mission was to protect the doughboys of the First Army. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations, others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators in 609 American planes, now a solid part of Allied air power, rose to attack. Germany put albatrosses, Fokkers, more than 30 different types of planes in action to fly no-man's land patrols. Some of the Huns dropped bombs by hand on our troops.
With over 120 different types of aircraft, the Allies fought back. Our boys were always quick to single out the enemy and come in close to attack. The German was hurt. He tried to escape, but couldn't make it. Our pilot signaled that he had made another kill. And after a victory roll, he rejoined his buddies. Other enemy ships strafed our observation balloons, burning them out of the sky.
Allied air power struck back in force. The sky was a beehive of battle. We overwhelmed their air defense, winning and holding air superiority. It was almost the same a few weeks later in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where we bombed with telling effect in the most notable aerial effort of the war. November 11, 1918, closed a chapter in the unending story of the United States Air Force. Visual history has shown us some of the courageous men in uniform and out who cradled the dream of flight and gave us aviation. In the history-making jobs that lay ahead is the inspiring chronicle of more Americans who continued the pioneer spirit. Men with an idea who planned and worked and fought to build the greatest striking force and protective power in history, the United States Air Force.
November 11th, 1918. Everyone celebrated the armistice in the Times Squares of the world. While victory flags still waved, America cut the Army Air Service 95%, making it a skeleton force. In France, our airmen had earned the admiration of the Allies, but economy only permitted a handful to rejoin the post-war ranks. Fortunately, among them were Mitchell, Brereton, Spotts, Arnold, and other future Air Force leaders. Many airmen, such as Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, left the service and adjusted themselves to the rigors of civilian life. A few became world famous, like Air Captain Fiorella LaGuardia. For those who stayed in, there was immediate need for their activities. To inaugurate the U.S. Airmail Service, which was pioneered by the Army, President Wilson escorted the First Lady.
The Postmaster General picked one of us Army pilots to be the first to fly the mail. With the benefit of the Red Cross, the President had addressed a letter to the Postmaster of New York City. Witnesses watched the famous first airmail letter being posted. Lack of instruments and navigation maps made flying tough, but we hoped jobs like this would increase public confidence in our ability. With the mail sacked up and ready to go, Wilson and the pilot discussed the proposed flight. Meanwhile, the 4 mail sacks were stashed away in the open cockpit under the President's friendly gaze. Then the pilot climbed aboard, little dreaming that less than 22 miles from Washington he'd get lost. Later, the first airmail was delivered by another pilot who followed the railroad tracks to New York.
Another Army assignment for men who stayed in uniform was Forest Fire Patrol. Quick detection brought about important savings in the nation's timber. But in those days, the one who most often captured the public's eye was the war-trained flyer who took up barnstorming. With a $50 surplus trainer and a complete disregard for the law of gravity, he worked in a drafty office only a few seconds a day. To wildcats like Howard Hawks, Roscoe Turner, and Stinson goes much credit for introducing America to the sky. Even the obsolete pusher, condemned by the Army before the war, helped popularize aviation, develop airfields, and add to the knowledge of flying. The crowds loved to watch the daredevils outdo each other with spectacular stunts. The steady-flying, easy-to-handle Jenny, standard Army trainer, was the barnstormer's favorite perch. Although some of the more reckless civilian flyers gave aviation a black eye, most of them helped America lead the world toward the air age.
Wherever there was business enough, the gypsy flyer settled down. He bought a bigger plane, rented a larger cow pasture, and often gave free rides, especially to the ladies. Rides with every modern convenience. Eventually, there grew up the private intercity taxi services which flew millions of miles, direct ancestors of today's big commercial lines.
After the war, Congress set up the Air Service as a permanent combat element and permitted training to start again. We studied aerial photography. As the eyes of the Army, one of the Air Service's primary missions was reconnaissance. The main tool was a high-speed aerial camera. After the pictures were taken, the glass plates were developed. Then a lab man made contact prints. Finally, these overlapping pictures were cut up and pasted down as a mosaic. Some of us were briefed for our first mission, strafing maneuvers. This strafing mission was against ground troops armed with anti-aircraft. With the help of the ground crews, we started the takeoffs. Still based on wartime practices, the training program was in 3 parts: primary, basic, advanced. In advanced, we specialized in bombardment, observation, pursuit, or attack. When they heard our engines roar, the troops ran for cover. Flying through their anti-aircraft fire, we strafed the enemy. A mule-drawn ack-ack blazed away.
The Army maintained an active, though limited, interest in a lighter-than-air program. At a school in Scottsfield, Illinois, men trained for work with free as well as semi-rigid balloons. AEF success with observation blimps inspired Army interest in non-rigid and semi-rigid airships for 20 years into the future. Air Service Chief General Charles Menaher took pride in showing flight training to General Reed, Commandant, 5th Army Corps. Together, they watched Major Carl Spott signal 18 pursuit crews to prepare for a mass graduation review. This was the big moment after more than a year of the toughest training in the world. As the newest members of the Air Service, they took off to do their part in building America's early air power. It was a magnificent sight to see these squadrons take possession of the air.
Flying safety was a constant goal, and development of a life-saving parachute which the early birds could trust was high on the list of equipment being researched. This test called for jumping off the wing backwards. Another method was having the slipstream open the chute and yank a man off the wing. Although parachutes had been offered by the Service of Supply for some time, our men didn't use them. To prove that the equipment worked, many of the test jumps were made by the inventors themselves.
Despite budget setbacks, the Air Service continued to make aviation history with record-breaking flights. Lieutenants Kelly and McCready won congratulations from the Dean of all flyers, Orville Wright, for setting several duration and distance records in the famous T-2, a hot ship. For the first non-stop coast-to-coast flight, the Air Service modified a giant commercial transport with special tanks in the wings. This was the third try by the same men in the same plane. 2 previous west-to-east hops had failed. In preparing the plane, 780 gallons of gas were pumped aboard. By flying from east to west, they hoped to use up most of the gas load before climbing the Rockies. This was not a stunt. John McCready and Oakley Kelly were part of a larger Army program to develop better planes, engines, and navigation, and to advance flying techniques. As the prop was spun, history took note of May 2nd, 1923 as a memorable day. One of the tensest moments was the takeoff. Would the monoplane, now weighing 10,000 pounds, clear the Curtiss hangars at the far end of the field? It did. Throughout the 2,250-mile route, the pilots took turns at the controls. Average speed, 94 miles an hour. Less than 27 hours later, the T-2 arrived over Rockwell Field, San Diego. After spanning a continent, the huge plane and its 2-man crew settled down to Earth. And the single Liberty engine now taxied the T-2 on California soil toward the excited crowds. By covering the greatest distance ever made in a single cross-country flight, Kelly and McCready proved that eventually, in a national emergency, troops could be transported from one coast to another in little more than a day.
In the early 20s, chief proponent for the value of air power was Brigadier General Mitchell. Since his return from France, he had insisted that an airplane could sink any surface ship. And when he argued that 1/2 the cost of a single new battle wagon could supply the planes to make the warship obsolete, Congress insisted he get the chance to prove it. For the tests, Billy Mitchell hastily assembled a force, including some Navy flyers, which he trained at Langley Field, Virginia. He taught them the same bombing techniques which he had learned in World War I. Engines were started, and the 1st Provisional Air Brigade took off for a mission which was to test the future of military aviation. Fast pursuits and heavy bombers, accompanied by auxiliary planes with cameras and observers, headed for the latest target, a U.S. battleship. By new tests conducted on the obsolete Alabama, Mitchell tried to clinch his claims. Through the use of phosphorus bombs, he demonstrated the fine art of precision bombing. A perfect hit. This was expert pinpoint bombing. Heavier bombs were now prepared by the armorers of the Air Brigade, and the SS Shawmut radioed orders for the new takeoffs. Power men signaled the heavy bombers, and again they displayed the same remarkable precision. But the Joint Board was still unconvinced even when more bombs finally sank the Alabama.
2 years later, Billy Mitchell and his men prepared for a new series of battleship bombing tests, this time against the obsolete battle wagons, New Jersey and Virginia. On the deck of the San Mihiel were General Pershing, Admiral Shoemaker, Assistant Secretary of War Davis, and the new Air Chief, General Patrick. The 1923 tests attracted even more widespread public and official attention.
The target sat and waited for a 2,000-pound bomb to be dropped from 10,000 feet. The Air Service was learning that a near miss was the body blow that weakened the hull, setting up a target for the knockout punch. Mitchell's Air Brigade was becoming more and more expert and could lay those eggs anywhere. A photo plane recorded everything on film. The beginning of the end of a mighty warship victim of precision bombing. A direct bomb strike had cleared the decks and armor plate buckled like a tin can. By showing her keel, the Virginia proved she's had enough. And she's on her way to join the other test victims, German sub U-117, destroyer G-102, light cruiser Frankfurt, and battleship Ostfriesland, as well as U.S. battleships Alabama and New Jersey.
Air power versus sea power. The tests were a brilliant success, even if many years were to go by before their significance was fully appreciated. For 10 years after the armistice, the job handed America's Air Service was a secondary one, support of the ground forces. Although later chapters in the Air Force story show the growth of the nation's air arm was inevitable, skeptics persisted in trying to stop progress. Thus, it was a slow and difficult climb to be allowed a more positive role in national defense, and eventually to prove, like Billy Mitchell did, the power punch of strategic bombardment and the peace power of the United States Air Force. 1930. Randolph Field was dedicated and a new Air Corps era began. One of the Army's first pilots, General Frank Lum, received congratulations as father of the West Point of the Air. It soon developed into one of the greatest air bases in the world. To this $10 million Texas Air City came headquarters for the Air Corps Training Center. Randolph eventually became the concrete nest where many of America's World War II Eagles learned to fly.
We held large-scale maneuvers in 1931 over the northeast quarter of the nation. Veteran flyer General Benjamin Floyd, who was to be named Chief of the Air Corps before the year was out, announced that this was the greatest concentration of Army Air Corps planes ever attempted. We had brought to Dayton, Ohio, almost 700 Martin, Keystone, and Curtiss two-engine bombers, backed by squadrons of swift Boeing P-12 pursuits. For a 9-day period in successful combat maneuvers, air crews practiced with all types of military aircraft, flying almost 2 million air miles. Outside San Antonio, Texas, the 3rd Attack Group, one of Hoyt Vandenberg's early outfits, developed techniques to destroy enemy planes on the ground. For targets, they used Weary Willies, a polite name for worn-out and obsolete aircraft. Each Keystone dropped a string of 3 bombs. The lesson: enemy planes destroyed on the ground can never menace the skies.
During the early 30s, President Hoover came to Bowling Field to decorate an ace. Air Corps Chief General James Fichet read the citation honoring Captain Eddie Rickenbacker for his heroism 12 years before in the battle skies over France.
For 2 other heroes, the Air Corps dispatched a non-rigid airship to salute a majestic monument rising from a stone star on the highest of the Kill Devil Hill, among the sand dunes near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Man's first successful flight was thus fittingly dedicated with a wreath from the sky. Here, the history of man's conquest of the air was inscribed in bronze and granite. At Washington ceremonies, only one brother was alive to hear the Distinguished Flying Cross citation read by Assistant Secretary of War Truby Davison and to receive the certificates from Secretary of War Dwight F. Davis. Orville accepted for Wilbur as well as himself. Together, they had built a machine which influenced the course of history.
While America engaged in peaceful pursuits, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese military machine was preparing for war. Her Army and Air Force swarmed over Manchuria, and aggression exploded. Japanese airplanes and ground troops in the fall of 1931 began an unwarranted attack on Manchuria, the beginning of world conflict.
In the States, we agents of the Indian Bureau had asked the War Department to help us get food to the snowbound Navajo tribes in Arizona. The 11th Bomb Squad came to us from March Field. After the flyers wrapped the supplies in blankets and fastened them to the bomb shackles, they hung the Mercy bundles inside the planes like bombs. Near a line of Curtiss bombers, we pointed out the first trading post on the map. The pilots called it the target. It was easy to see that this winter of '32 was a man-killer as we flew north past Navajo Mountain, traveling 133 miles an hour in open plains at 0 temperatures. We searched the mesa. There it is, the big lodge in the middle of the staked fence. Flying low, the pilot put the B-2 Condor on the bomb run. Skimming over the foothills, it felt like we'd surely graze those trees on the ridge. There go the Mercy bombs. It was magic. Machines designed for killing an enemy were saving our friend. We almost tripped on our own shadow as we waved goodbye and headed back. Agents on the scene reported that by dropping 15 tons of supplies, the Air Corps had saved entire families. Our aviators engaged in peaceful pursuits. At the same time, there were war rumblings in Europe. While we flew missions of mercy, an ominous voice was threatening the peace of the world.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
Many of us in America had made the mistake of laughing at this Adolf Hitler. From 1933 on, his leaders made their party day in the city of Nuremberg a tremendous spectacle. The Nazis had finally come into power. These very same kids were to face Allied armies, navies, and air forces only a short time later. Within 6 years, as Germany's Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, they threatened the freedom of all the world.
Back home in 1934, there was a conflict over charges that the United States Post Office Department was paying exorbitantly high rates to commercial lines for carrying the nation's airmail. Contracts were canceled, and by presidential direction, Postmaster General James A. Farley signed the order turning the job over to the Army Air Corps, which had pioneered flying the mail. In obsolete planes, including open cockpit fighters and trainers, we maintained day and night airmail schedules. In spite of weather and the lack of equipment, the men of the Air Corps tackled the job as though flying the mail was a series of combat missions. Operating from airfields which still used World War I searchlights and flying without a beacon system, crashes were inevitable. The nation wondered how the Air Corps could ever carry bombs if it couldn't carry mail. But investigations disclosed that if we had been given the planes, personnel, and training funds for which we battled all those years, we could have done this or any job.
The 30s also began to see a change in Army aircraft design. Sleek monoplanes, all metal construction. General Falloy had urged the aviation industry to compete in the building of a fast bomber. And Boeing delivered the 163-mile-an-hour B-9. The same year, Boeing took a powerful 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine and strapped on a rugged 24-foot saddle. They called the result a P-26. These first all-metal pursuit monoplanes were still on hand 9 years later when the Philippine Air Force tried to use them against the Japs. Pitted against the B-9, the Boeing fighter and bomber put each other through their paces. Kicking up a top speed of 230 miles an hour, it easily outstripped the B-9 bomber and many other planes of the period. Another entry in the bomber competition was Martin's early version of the B-10, also a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane. It had a waist gun, a nose gun, and an efficient bomb bay which could close on a 2,000-pound argument. This armament, plus a 1,300-mile range, made it the most powerful bomber of the time, while its speed of 207 miles an hour made it the fastest in the world.
An excellent trial for the new B-10s came in 1934 when Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold and Majors Hugh Nur and Ralph Royce led 27 officers and men on a long-range test flight. Takeoff, Washington, D.C. Destination, Fairbanks, Alaska. Mission, to fly over extensive Alaskan territory, photograph strategic landing areas, determine the feasibility of sending an Air Force to Alaska in an emergency, and report on frontier defense. On the return trip from Juneau to Seattle, the crews flew non-stop through fog and rainstorms, 990 miles. Thus, as early as 1934, the Air Corps proved that it was technically possible for an enemy to bomb the United States from the Arctic. After reaching Washington, the Alaskan flyers were honored at Bowling Field. Later, in new trials, the Army Air Corps set out to prove that B-10s could operate under extreme Arctic conditions.
During back-breaking exercises, picked crews battled freezing equipment as they tried to operate their planes and weapons in sub-zero temperatures. Lessons learned in these cold weather tests proved invaluable 7 years later when Japan reached for the United States via Alaska. While the new bombers had in a sense moved America's frontier to Alaska, they also demonstrated that should the need ever arise, this same frontier could receive aid by air.
At West Point, where the Army's future officers were schooled, the only flight training for cadets up to June 1935 was the time they put in flying over the hurdles during cavalry maneuvers. But the class of '36 was the first to start aviation indoctrination. To Mitchell Field, New York, came 279 cadets in 3 separate groups, under command of Air Training Officer Major Omar N. Bradley. Each group prepared to stay a week to get 20 hours of flying, along with extensive ground courses from Army and Air Corps experts like Air Officer Lieutenant Colonel Walter H. Frank. In this first detachment were future Colonels Richard Carmichael, Clinton True, Gordon Austin, and Benjamin Davis, among others. They studied aircraft familiarization, gunnery, and engines. Before long, orders of the day called the names for the first flight. Down the line went the cadets, trailing their waltzing Matildas. Engines were warming up as the cadets climbed aboard, bucking the slipstream. Pilots took the controls and the line of obsolescent LB-6 bombers taxied off the hard stand. At Mitchell, the runway was a cleared field where the big planes formed a huge oval, treating the West Pointers to an Air Corps dress parade prior to taking off. After flying over New York City, the lead Keystone bomber headed due north toward the point. Gunnery familiarization was on the curriculum, as was instrument reading, cross-country, formation flying, and avigation. En masse, the three flights roared up the Hudson River to salute the United States Military Academy at West Point.
For the years between wars, the Army Air Corps continued to make progress, and U.S. Army Chief of Staff reports began to attach greater importance to military aviation. Squadrons exercised as real fighting units, with the General Staff finally conceding that the Air Arm might be utilized for independent operations. As the next film chapter will show, hopes of big bomber advocates boomed during a period of alarming developments on the world scene. In this prelude to war, weapons for American defensive strength and long-range striking power were being developed and proved by the United States Air Force. 1939. The United States, shocked by appeasement at Munich, had her leaders take a closer look at military aviation. While exploring the values of small bombers like the B-18 against the more costly Flying Fortress, they approved experimental projects for the B-15, whose four engines proved too weak for the giant's weight and wingspan of 149 feet, and for the lumbering B-19, which boasted a record span of 212 feet. However, both new ships did pay dividends in future bomber development.
It finally took world events to give the U.S. Air Force its biggest shot in the arm. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German Army and Luftwaffe in a lightning-like campaign. The map was Poland. The plan was surprise. 20 years before, President Wilson had warned us that any future war will inevitably open with great aerial activity. Wilson was right. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitz in the history of the world. Poland died on its air force. With this earth-shattering overture, played by strafing Stuka bombers, World War II began. Ironically, the method the Germans followed in this Polish campaign was the same one by which we, on a far larger scale, would defeat Germany. As thousands of bombs demolished Polish cities, the U.S. Air Corps learned a lesson. Now Hitler's threat, today Germany, tomorrow the world, was both believed and feared.
In the United States, the president proclaimed a national emergency.
We immediately put a huge expansion program into operation. It took no time at all before we ran out of facilities, as we raised air crew and other training goals. From an all-volunteer corps of 23,000 in 1939, we grew 100-fold as more volunteers and draftees joined up. Science helped us choose their specialties. There were physical as well as mental requirements for the hundreds of skills which we eventually taught to 2.5 million men and women who became our ground and air crews. We measured a man's oxygen needs as well as his muscular and mental coordination. We devised mechanical aptitude tests and general classification tests which indicated ability to learn in the many technical categories. As General Arnold declared, the Air Corps had to become the largest single educational organization in a very short time. We were an army of specialists. In schools all over the country, we learned our trades from experts and became airplane mechanics, cooks and bakers, communications men, bombardiers, armorers, meteorologists. We learned hundreds of technical jobs, and finally we were a tremendous team of skilled Americans who knew how to keep them flying.
America's ability to mass-produce complex military aircraft was essentially a civilian miracle. However, in 1940, as in 1917, defense work didn't get started until late. War had stopped the wheels of industry, and conversion took time, valuable time. Many factors made the miracle possible. Waiting airplane designs, inexhaustible raw materials and highly adaptable industry, a variety of well-established aviation companies, willing defense workers, and a goal.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
Many said this was impossible, but the new models were ready. B-25 Mitchell by North American. P-38 Lightning by Lockheed. B-26 Marauder by Martin. P-39 Air Cobra by Bell. B-24 Liberator by Consolidated. And P-40 Kitty Hawk by Curtiss. But 50,000 aircraft meant speeding up from 2,000 planes a year to more than 4,000 planes per month. Could America do it?
When German forces, led by her Luftwaffe, began to overrun the map of Europe early in 1940, across Denmark and Norway, then southward, speeding over Holland and Belgium toward France, I, as a military observer, filed my reports. The air war that everyone feared had, in fact, started. The smirking Luftwaffe was repeating its Polish success as it paved the way for advancing panzers which crushed 3.5 million French soldiers. While German troops and airmen goose-stepped on the heart of Paris, the Luftwaffe was invincible. But the triumphs of 1939 and 40 had all been scored against weak opposition. After the French surrender, June 22nd, only the RAF remained for the Luftwaffe to conquer. A test of strength soon came, the Battle for Britain. The Luftwaffe set to its task of controlling all Western Europe by crossing the Channel. German engines forecast a rain of death. The RAF was ready but outnumbered. Warned of the approaching attack, their fighter command sprang to the task of trying to hold off the invasion. While Britain's spotters and warning centers tracked the enemy planes, I watched the island's defenses go into action. The outnumbered few fought back with more than blood, sweat, and tears. They had Spitfires and Hurricanes in their aircraft arsenal and a modest but well-trained force of airmen. The best that Goering had to offer was knocked out of the sky. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered 2-1, fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill and chased them back across the Channel. Then Britain's warning centers reported that Goering switched to night raids. London was still the main target, but the people had learned to take it. Although slowed down by ground and air defenses, the Luftwaffe's final effort was desperate. Her repeated night raids on southern ports and shipping were furious, but Britain was saved.
Out of the London Blitz came new cooperation with friendly nations for U.S. air defense. The President revealed an agreement transferring 50 overage destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for the right to establish air and naval bases at 8 key points. We received 99-year leases on sites in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Antigua, Trinidad, and British Guiana. For bases such as these, late in 1941, Army engineers began to practice building airfields in a hurry, a job they eventually did all around the world. At the Louisiana and Carolina maneuvers, steel carpets for airplanes were tried with excellent results. Air leaders call these landing mats the year's greatest achievement in aviation. Rivalry between Air Commanders William Kepner and Asa Duncan was keen, and every effort was made to simulate actual war conditions as they existed in Europe at the moment. Except that Hitler didn't use sacks of flour. High
high point of the maneuver was the lesson learned from the first large-scale use of American airplanes to move armies. On November 22nd, the fleet of C-47s unloaded a complete battalion of airborne infantry to help capture Pope Field, North Carolina. In the sham battle that followed, all the new planes distinguished themselves. Attesting to the gains made during the years of experimental flight, technical advance, expanding man and machine power, the nation's air arm was being prepared for grueling events now only days ahead.
December 6, 1941, Honolulu. Although alerted, the city went about its business in the usual way. December 6, 1941, Hamilton Field, California. We were under orders to get every available B-17 to the Philippine Islands. General Arnold personally inspected the air movement of the 13 B-17. They carried no armament because of the heavy gas load necessary for the 3,000-mile hop to Oahu.
Dawn, December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean. A Japanese task force was also heading for Oahu. Mission, sneak attack. Primary targets, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. Exactly at 0600, the fateful signal was given. And the first wave, 200 fighters, horizontal bombers, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers roared off. Pearl was an ideal target because through greater fear of sabotage than air attack, ships and planes had been brought together rather than dispersed.
When the B-17s from California finally approached the island, their engines were heard by some of our men at Pearl and Hickam. At the same instant, from another direction, the Japs struck. In the midst of the onslaught, the unarmed B-17s arrived. Our pilots could do no more than find a place to land.
Wave after wave of enemy planes bombed American aircraft and units of the Pacific Fleet in a treacherous attack which achieved perfect tactical surprise.
Other Japs went after U.S. fighters on auxiliary fields. In spite of the terrific pounding, our pilots and mechanics were able to get 4 P-40s and 2 P-36s in the air within the first 30 minutes and offer some resistance. In the face of overwhelming odds, Lieutenants Harry Brown, Robert Rogers, Kenneth Taylor, John Webster, and George Welch, among many others, fought back as best they could. At the end of the single air attack, the United States had suffered a crushing blow, and the nation was at war.
The Jap squadrons returned to their carriers with a loss of only 49 planes, a cheap price for so great a victory. Although America had paid heavily for being unprepared, the U.S. Air Force, led by men like Hap Arnold, began to rise from the disaster.
We are faced with a tough job, but I know that we can do it. And with all due reverence, I say, by God, we will do it.